I checked my oxygen gauge one last time before entering that black water. 12 kids were dying in the darkness ahead, and I had exactly enough air to reach them, but not enough to come back. July 5th, 2018. Tam Long Cave, northern Thailand. The water was black as oil and cold as death, stretching ahead into tunnels no human was meant to navigate. My name is Saman Kienan, former Thai Navy SEAL, and I was about to make a dive that would either save 13 lives or cost me mine. On my back were 3 oxygen tanks, the lifeline for the trapped soccer team who'd been sitting in total darkness for 2 weeks, their air slowly running out with each breath. The mission was simple: swim through flooded caves for 45 minutes, deliver the tanks, and swim back. What made it deadly was that I was carrying so much weight, I'd calculated wrong. I had enough oxygen to reach the boys, but the math said I'd run out 10 minutes before making it home. The 12 boys and their coach had been trapped for 14 days in a chamber 4 kilometers deep inside the cave system. Monsoon rains had flooded their only exit, turning familiar walking paths into deadly underwater mazes. Every day they stayed down there, the oxygen in their cave was dropping. Every hour we delayed, they were closer to suffocation. The world was watching this rescue attempt, holding its breath as elite divers from around the globe risked everything to bring them out alive. But I wasn't thinking about the world. I was thinking about my wife Filipoan, asleep back in Bangkok, who had no idea her husband was about to swim into an underwater tomb. I'd left the Navy SEALs 12 years ago, traded my diving gear for a security guard uniform at Bangkok's airport. Peaceful work, safe work, the kind of job that lets you come home every night to kiss your wife and plan for the future. But when my old unit called for volunteers, when they said kids were dying in the dark and they needed every experienced diver they could get, there was never really a choice. This is what SEALs do. We swim toward danger when everyone else swims away. The only question was whether I still had what it took after 12 years behind a desk. At 8:37 p.m., I slipped into the black water at Chamber 3, the staging area we'd established deep inside the cave. The cold hit me like a physical blow, even through my wet suit. This wasn't normal cave diving. This was navigating through a flooded tomb, following a guide rope through passages so narrow that your tank scraped against both walls, so dark that your flashlight beam disappeared after 3 feet. One wrong turn, one moment of panic, one equipment failure, and you joined the boys you came to save. The weight of the oxygen tanks on my back made every movement slow, deliberate, exhausting. The guide rope led through passages that had been marked by other divers, but the current had shifted everything. What had been a clear path yesterday was now a maze of debris and fallen rocks. I had to navigate by feel, following the rope with one hand while checking my compass and depth gauge with the other. The silence was absolute except for the sound of my own breathing through the regulator, slow, steady, controlled. Navy SEAL breathing. Each exhale was a bubble of precious air I'd never get back. Each inhale brought me closer to the moment when my tanks would run dry. 20 minutes in, I reached the first major obstacle. A passage so narrow I had to remove my tanks and push them ahead of me, following behind like a snake through a pipe. This was where other divers had turned back, where the physics of human anatomy meets the reality of solid rock. But those tanks weren't going to deliver themselves, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, 13 people were breathing the last of their air. I forced my body through the gap, feeling the rock scrape against my wet suit, feeling the walls close in until there was barely room to move my arms. 30 minutes in, my air gauge showed what I already knew. I was past the point of no return. Even if I turned around right now, even if I swam faster than humanly possible, I wouldn't make it back to Chamber 3 alive. But ahead of me, getting closer with each stroke, were the boys. I could almost hear them in the darkness, scared, cold, probably convinced they were going to die in that cave. As long as my regulator kept working, as long as my tanks held out for 10 more minutes, I could give them hope. I could give them life. That had to be enough. The T-junction appeared in my flashlight beam like a fork in an underwater road. Left led to Pattaya Beach, the dry chamber where the boys were waiting. Right led to other passages, other ways to get lost forever in the maze. I'd studied this junction on maps, memorized every detail, but maps drawn on paper don't capture the disorientation of being 40 feet underwater in absolute darkness. I chose left, following the rope that other divers had laid, trusting equipment and training over fear and doubt. At 42 minutes, I saw it. The air pocket of Pattaya Beach, a bubble of life in the flooded cave system. I surfaced into the chamber where the boys had been living like castaways, and for a moment, the sight took my breath away. 13 faces looking at me from the darkness, thin and scared but alive, so beautifully alive. "We brought oxygen," I said in my broken English, pulling the tanks from my back. "You're going to be okay." The relief in their eyes was worth every risk I'd taken to get there. This was why I'd become a SEAL, why I'd answered the call to volunteer. This moment when hope replaces despair. But even as I delivered the tanks, even as I showed them how to use the equipment properly, the mathematics of my situation were catching up with me. My air gauge was deep in the red zone now, the needle touching empty. I had maybe 5 minutes of air left, and the swim back to Chamber 3 would take at least 15. The boys were watching me, trusting me, depending on me to get back to the surface and bring help. I couldn't let them see the truth in my eyes, that I was about to attempt an impossible dive on fumes. "Stay strong," I told them, forcing a smile despite the fear clawing at my chest. "The real divers are coming soon. You'll be home with your families before you know it." I slipped back into the water, leaving behind the warmth of human contact for the cold mathematics of underwater physics. The return journey started the same as the approach, following the guide rope, navigating by feel and instinct through passages that seemed even narrower now that I was fighting panic along with physics. 10 minutes into the return dive, my primary regulator gave its first warning cough. The sound that means your air supply is nearly gone. I switched to my backup regulator, buying myself maybe 3 more minutes of life. The T-junction was still ahead of me, and beyond that, the narrow passage where I'd have to remove my tanks. I was swimming through liquid darkness on borrowed time, each stroke of my arms bringing me closer to the moment when my lungs would start screaming for air that wasn't there. That's when it happened. 15 minutes into the return journey, 20 meters short of the T-junction, my backup regulator delivered its last breath. I tried to stay calm, tried to remember my training about emergency ascents and buddy breathing, but there was no surface above me and no buddy beside me. There was only black water and the slow realization that I wasn't going to make it home. The last thing I remember was the rope in my hand and the thought that at least the boys had their oxygen. At least someone would live because of this dive. My diving partner found me floating unconscious at the T-junction, my body drifting at the end of the guide rope like a flag marking the spot where hope meets reality. He tried CPR in the water, tried to force life back into lungs that had given everything they had. They brought me to Chamber 3, tried CPR again on solid ground, worked on my body for hours. But I was already gone, already swimming in deeper waters than any human has ever explored. The boys made it out 3 days later, all 13 of them, rescued by international teams using the oxygen I'd delivered and the route I'd helped map. They lived because a security guard from Bangkok decided to answer an old call to duty, because sometimes the price of heroism is exactly one life, paid in full. Thailand's king promoted me posthumously and awarded me the Knight Grand Cross of the most exalted order of the White Elephant, one of the country's highest honors. My wife Filippoan told the media she missed me dearly, but didn't want the boys to blame themselves for my death. But here's what the newspapers didn't print, what the king's citation couldn't capture. I knew the math before I made that dive. I knew there wasn't enough air in my tanks to make the round trip carrying those extra oxygen cylinders. Every Navy SEAL learns to calculate gas consumption rates, to plan dives with safety margins and backup plans. I ran those numbers in my head a dozen times, and every time they came out the same. Going to Pattaya Beach was a one-way trip. So why did I go? Why did I clip those tanks to my harness and slip into that black water, knowing I probably wouldn't surface again? Because 13 people were dying in the dark, and I was the only one who could reach them in time. Because sometimes heroism isn't about surviving. It's about making sure others do. Because I'd rather die as a Navy SEAL on a mission than live as a security guard with regrets. The rescue operation continued for days after my death, divers and engineers working around the clock to bring those boys home. The following year, another Thai Navy SEAL, Beirut Pakbara, died from a blood infection he'd contracted during the rescue operation. We paid the price so 13 young lives could continue, so their families could have their sons back, so the world could remember that some things are worth dying for. Today, there are statues and monuments commemorating the Tam Luang rescue, tributes to international cooperation and human courage. But the real monument isn't made of bronze or stone. It's 13 young men who grew up knowing that strangers died to save them, who carry the weight and the gift of that sacrifice every day of their lives. When you're rescued by heroes, you don't just get your life back, you get the responsibility to make that life worth saving. Despite my death, I was able to deliver those vital oxygen tanks to the cave, allowing the children to survive long enough to be rescued by the international teams. That's the mathematics of heroism. Sometimes one life spent wisely can save many lives completely. The boys made it home to their families. I made it home to something else, something deeper and more permanent than any earthly reunion. Share this story to remember that heroes aren't people who don't feel fear. Heroes are people who feel the fear, do the math, understand the cost, and dive in anyway because someone has to. And today, that someone was me.